Welcome back, everyone, to the Get On and Walking podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Gesche Kindermann. Gesche is the Director of the MSc in Environmental Leadership in NUIG Galway, and she's involved in a number of different research projects as well, including the Sheer Wellbeing Project and the Near Health Project. These projects, as well as some of the teaching that Gesche is involved in, is really around green and blue spaces and how they impact our health and well-being. And that particular topic was kind of the anchor of our conversation today. We spoke a lot about the importance of these spaces for our health and well-being, as well as why it's important to continue conducting research in this area. We touch on COVID-19 as well, and how that's actually changed the way Irish people have engaged with and the value that they place on these green and blue spaces. So if you're interested in this type of work and this type of research, I'd really recommend listening to this conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure you will too. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Gesche Kindermann. Okay, Gesche, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the Get On and Walking podcast. Thanks so much for offering your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Brilliant. Can we maybe start off with a bit of an overview as to what's involved in your day job in NUIG Galway? What's your research and teaching about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm a lecturer in environmental science, and mostly what I teach or look at is looking at nature conservation. So teaching kind of the different habitats and species that are in Ireland, what they need and how we look after them, how we protect them, how we might look at different forms of management of these areas, that sort of thing. So we have undergraduate courses in environmental science and then our master's courses in similar fields as well. And ultimately what we're looking for is looking at habitats, looking at how they're being used, what potential negative impacts there are, how we can prevent them, and how we can look at finding solutions that engage people with these spaces in a way that doesn't do damage to these areas, basically is what I mostly teach. In addition, there's a couple of other bits and pieces, but that's kind of the gist of it. And ultimately what we're looking at is kind of that healthy promotion of using of outdoor spaces and managing them accordingly.
Cool.
I'll let you take a question.
Yeah, no, but I just kind of wanted to follow up about green and blue spaces and really how they're defined. I suppose it's a bit of a weird one to define. Is it like what constitutes a green or a blue space?
Absolutely. No, it's kind of an abstract concept. And it's really just something we use for research purposes most of the time, although we do find it comes more and more into kind of common conversation as well. But it's basically, we just need to be able to define our natural world in a way that we're all kind of agreeing on what we're referring to, because, saying things like nature means such different things to different people. For some people, when I say nature, it is the wilds of Connemara where there's absolutely no other person around. To somebody else, nature is and includes people and, the spider in the corner of your room. So we kind of had to start thinking about, what other terminology is there to define natural spaces outdoors? And that's how we come to blue and green spaces. And you know what? They usually are. If you look at a map, the spaces that are drawn in blue or in green. So our green spaces are generally spaces that are kind of woodlands, they're fields, they're parks, they might also be gardens. Although for research purposes, gardens are often excluded because they're not public spaces as such, but any kind of a green space that's accessible to the public is generally a green space. And as I said, but that appears green. So it's like a woodland, for example. A blue space then is what normally looks blue, although it's not always necessarily blue when you see it in real life, but blue spaces include things such as lakes, rivers, streams, canals, and obviously the sea, because we do have plenty of that in Ireland. So it's our waterways, it's our surface waterways in any way, shape or form, be that fresh water or marine. That's blue spaces.
And a big part of your research recently has been kind of these spaces in relation to our health and well-being, has it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been looking at. As I said, I'm an environmental scientist, and I've always come from the perspective of looking after blue and green spaces for conservation purposes, which often tends to exclude people, And I realized very soon that really we can't look at these spaces without people, because it's people who use these spaces. And so it's figuring out how people use these spaces, but also how can we combine protection of these spaces with the use that is a responsible form of use of these areas? So how can we ensure that people have access to these areas, but also know what value these spaces have for us, so that they treat them with respect and responsibility, so that these spaces can still provide those functions for us that are so incredibly valuable for us. So,
and what was that transition like, kind of moving into starting to research people? Was it difficult for you as an environmental scientist?
Yeah, well, like, it was an interesting one. It didn't necessarily come natural, because I think as environmental scientists, we're often kind of like, oh no, people are bad. We need to go and, figure out how we keep them out of areas. And all of a sudden you had to kind of say, well, actually, no, that's not what this is about. This is about finding a workable compromise between both. And the other thing about it is that, in particular in Ireland, most of our habitats, our natural spaces, are in some way or shape even created or influenced by humans. So even that background to spaces is really, really important in having to work with people. But I guess what I really noticed was the fact that people don't necessarily want to look after places that they don't see as valuable, or that they don't have a connection to. So it's really about figuring out that kind of crux of kind of going, well, where does that value sit? Where do we get people to understand that these spaces have value for them, so that they're willing to care for them? And to be honest, it was a fantastic transition. I really it was really, really good to kind of turn it around and move away from just looking at, say, plants and animals, and kind of saying, well, actually, this is so much more, and adding that human dimension to it. And people really broadened out my understanding of these natural spaces as well, which is fantastic.
Mm. And did you find it hard? Like, the places are becoming more and more urban now, and like green and blue spaces are probably few and far between in some places, and they will continue to be so. Like, when we say engage with these spaces, do you just have to be in a woodland or in a field, or is there a kind of conscious element to that?
Well, that's a good question. Well, to be honest, sometimes we are in nature and we're not consciously aware of it. But as you very rightly say, it's difficult to actually engage with these spaces sometimes, because we're quite removed from them. So what we would have looked at an awful lot, or what I would have been quite interested in, is, things such as, where are these spaces? How can people access them? And how could they, as we use that word, engage with them? So it's about kind of looking where in our increasingly urbanized world, and it is a case that it is becoming increasingly more urbanized, and we are putting our natural resources more and more under pressure. Where can we find these spaces that are our blue and green spaces, and how can we get to them? And it's kind of really important to look at how different people do it, because it's not the same for everybody. But a couple of things that really have stood out is always that what we really are looking for is for these places to be nearby, because it's not always easy to travel huge distances. So if we are looking for people to go out into nature, or into blue spaces, into green spaces, ideally we don't want them to be very, very far away, so that people have easy access, so that people can get there easily, and then, as I said, engage with them. But ultimately, engaging with them really just means that you might go and sit on a park bench and just take a moment, take a deep breather, and just enjoy what's happening around you, be that the sounds or the smells, but also the sights of the site. Or it might be much more active engagement, in terms of, you might go for a walk, but you might also go and go for a strenuous hike up a mountain, or you might go surfing or swimming. So it completely depends. Engagement is very, very different for different people, and it's different at different levels. It might be kind of, as I said, something very calm, such as even just taking photographs of it, painting it, calmly engaging with it, or else, as I said, deciding to do something a little bit more strenuous in terms of strenuous exercise. But all of it is good, and all of it is what we kind of need to consider if we're looking at what people do in these spaces, because all these actions take place.
Yeah. And do we have, sorry, Dev, has your research kind of focused on access to these spaces?
Some of it, we have looked at access a little bit, kind of how it works, but we've also looked at that benefit that we get from that access and that engagement. So one of the first things we actually needed to do, there's a couple of things that actually kind of started. The first thing was that kind of transition of saying, well, what do people actually mean when we say things like nature? Because we really quickly realized that we couldn't just talk about engaging with nature, because it meant so many different things to so many different people, which is why we shifted to that terminology of blue and green spaces. But then the first thing that we actually did is we looked at, what do people value in these blue and green spaces? How do they go out there? How do they engage with it? But also, what barriers are there? So it was really important for us to look at how people actually see nature and how they use it, or how they find themselves prevented from using it. Are they being held back in some way, shape, or form? So we looked at engaging with people who actively use outdoor spaces, but also those who maybe don't yet do so very actively yet. So people who, have never thought of going for a walk in a park somewhere, because it's not something that's part of their daily routine. So we just wanted to see what it is that gets people out and going. And one of the things that we initially found was, when we asked for value, is that people do value nature, and people do think it is something that should be available for everybody. But again, that route to that engagement is different for everybody. And then we looked at, as I said, what people already do. And a lot of people do already go out. They go for a walk. They go for a sea swim or a lake swim. They go hiking, or they go surfing. They go, kayaking. So a lot of people already use it, and they value things such as, the sound of the sea, for example. They find it really relaxing and calming, or even the sound of trees as well. That sort of thing, that value was already there. But then when we looked at the barriers of what's prevented people from going, it was the fact that for some people, the idea of nature was something that was far away, so you had to travel to it. So travel restriction might apply, or the fact that somebody might not have a car, or you may not be able to access spaces by public transport, for example. So people felt that maybe it was something they had to travel to, and they didn't really have the means to travel, or even the time to travel, because that's the other thing. People often perceive themselves as very time poor. And let's be fair, we do all work longer hours, and it gets longer and longer all the time. So sometimes people find it hard to find that time to go outdoors to connect with the space, or to even just walk as far as the park down the road, because you're kind of going, well, actually, I need to go and finish work. Then I need to go and, I don't know, hoover the house, do some shopping. There's kids to collect from an after school activity, so there's so many other demands on our time that it often comes last when we're looking at time for ourselves to go outside. So that was definitely one of the barriers. But people also really found that things such as poor access in terms of, for example, paths into a park, or facilities that are kind of neglected, where maybe benches are starting to fall down, or bins are not being emptied, or even there's a load of litter lying around. It's not very attractive to go to these places. Like, we do prefer places that are actually well maintained and that look nice. And also people prefer places that are, for example, kind of at least perceived as being really biodiverse, so that have loads of different species in them, where we might have trees and loads of different flowers, birds, butterflies. So people like these kind of places, and not every place can provide that. So it's a little bit difficult in terms of looking at the barriers that are there. But overall, we do find that people, at least when they do get to go out, they value it greatly, which is brilliant to see. So that was one of the findings we had. But yeah, that was the first step, really, like understanding what got people out and what might stop them from going outside.
And was there a kind of follow-on stage from that study, or from that piece then?
So we've done other elements. So the next step for this particular study was to look at then, if we know what the barriers are, how can we help people overcome them? How can we figure out what we can do, or how we can promote people going outside? So we did a lot of work with different community groups to kind of see how their spaces worked and how they would like to see these spaces changed. But we also went and got different groups of people to take part in different activities. So some of the activities we would have gone, for example, is we would have looked at groups that go out sea swimming and to see how they feel before and after having gone for a swim, to see whether or not it actually does have an impact on our health and well-being, whether or not an activity in an outdoor space actually does what we always feel it does. Kind of most of us have gone outside, we've gone for a walk, or we've gone and done some sort of activity, and we kind of feel better afterwards. So we kind of tend to kind of go, yeah, of course it makes us feel better. But we were actually looking for that hard evidence. We wanted that evidence of being able to say, well, actually, we surveyed so many people and we were able to show that, yes, going for a walk did actually make them feel better. So therefore, we looked at a whole different number of groups and providers that did loads of different things. So we looked at people who might have gone sailing, or people who would have gone surfing. We looked at people who went on biodiversity walks. We did that in conjunction with Cray actually as well. We looked at people going for hikes up mountains, and just, as I said, surveyed them before and after to get that evidence. And in general, what we found was that people did feel better. Even despite, in some cases, absolutely treacherous conditions when we had terrible rain, but people still felt better afterwards. So you might have found people who, prior to an activity, would have ranked things such as their own kind of like high anxiety levels, high stress levels, things such as being maybe not as satisfied with their overall health or their life as such. They found afterwards they felt better, they were less anxious, they were less stressed, they were much calmer, they were relaxed. But we also found that things such as biodiversity walks, for example, connected people with nature much more, that they started appreciating what they saw around them and really enjoyed the walk. We had a few people, for example, who would have said, oh, I don't like walking for exercise, but going out to walk to look at nature and to maybe go and to look at a view was something that actually really appealed to them. So taking them out on a number of different walks meant that they got to see loads of different things, but they also slowly but surely increased their step count. So, they also became fitter, which was great to see. But it was kind of more of a health by stealth kind of approach, because they was like, oh no, I don't want to go and, I don't want to go out there for exercise. I'm not that person. And that's something we got a few times where people kind of felt, I'm not that person. I'm not the person who goes for a run around the park, or, but I'm that person who goes out to look at butterflies. So, so it's kind of finding that connection with different people was really, really interesting. But yeah, overall, we did find that hard evidence, or that evidence to show that people did indeed feel both mentally and physically better for having gone and done some sort of outdoor-based activity in a green or blue space. So that was brilliant to see.
It's really positive findings. I know it's probably a difficult question to answer, but do we know what it is about these spaces that is beneficial for our health and well-being? Is there evidence to say it's the air quality, or it's the colors, or it's the,
Yeah, no, that is a difficult question. There's a number of different studies. So as I said earlier, we do actually know that people appreciate spaces more, for example, that are more biodiverse. So like, where there are more colors and more species around. And so therefore, these are spaces that they're more drawn to. But a lot of the time, it's that calm that these spaces provide. These spaces provide us with a space where we kind of disconnect from, I guess, the pace of other life. It's a space that's, kind of, you're moving at your own space, you're moving at your own pace, your own speed, whichever way you look at it. But again, we do know as well, for example, in terms of physical exercise in outdoor spaces, it's that physical element of it that's great, but it's even better if it's done in an outdoor space. But you're very, very right. It's the actual, what exactly is it? It's more likely to be a combination of factors than it just being one specific thing, even though one might stand out to us individually. So, for example, we know that for water in particular, it's that immersion effect of kind of in a completely different environment has a significant impact on people, which sometimes then translates to kind of a forest environment as well, because you can be quite enveloped or immersed in a forest as well, because it surrounds you entirely. But yeah, it's generally a combination of effects. I can't give you an answer of like that. It's just the one thing.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I kind of anticipated an answer like that. But do you think we should be focusing more effort on that side of things, or rather the kind of motivations and barriers to getting people into these spaces? Do you think, or should it be a combination of both?
I think it should be a combination of both, because everybody has a different reason for going out, you know? And on the one hand, it's for some people, it's really just even to get out of the house. I mean, we've never felt it more than when we're all somehow confined to, our very limited spaces, that we kind of went, I just want to get out. So for some of us, there's just a drive to get away from somewhere to go somewhere else. But it's providing the relevant spaces, and it's about kind of, I think, a joint message of, look, these spaces are incredibly good for you. And these spaces are very accessible and open for you. It's not only about the connection with nature that you build in these spaces, because that's the other thing. People always feel closer to nature when they've taken part in any kind of activity in an outdoor environment. So it's you can see, you get to know that place, which is great. It gives you that connection to nature, but it can also mean that it's a social connection. So, for example, if it's a social activity, you also make social connections, which adds to that general sense of well-being. So it's, for some people, it's to go out and meet somebody to go for a walk, so therefore that social element is really, really important in that as well. So again, because it's not just one factor that makes us feel better, it's kind of looking at all the different aspects that are there. Because ultimately, those spaces that we have, our blue and green spaces out there, they provide a multitude of users with a multitude of opportunities. And that's really what it's about. But it is about making sure that these spaces are open for everybody to use, that we look at how people can access them. And it's also about figuring out, for example, how can we make sure that it's not just accessible to one category of people? How is it not just accessible to, your healthy 30-year-old who wants to go for a run? How do we make sure it's also accessible for a mother with a pram, and it's also accessible for, maybe somebody who's elderly and might require a walking aid? How is it accessible for a wheelchair? So it's making sure that we kind of look at all of these different aspects together, that it's accessible, that we also provide nice spaces for people to go into, that we make sure these are free of kind of, let's say, rubbish, or that they're not kind of falling down, but also that we tell people about the value that they have for them. They will experience it, but often not necessarily consciously so. So therefore, it's kind of important to draw that attention to the fact that, look, these places are really, really good for you. And if you haven't tried it, you should go and try it. So, I hope that answered your question in some obscure way.
No, it did. Can I ask about the publication that you put out there recently as part of the Sheer Wellbeing Project in relation to COVID and how we used green and blue spaces during COVID? Like you mentioned it there a couple of minutes ago, like the way we used the spaces around our houses, our neighborhoods, has significantly changed. And I know that you published something with your research group there. What were some of the big findings coming from that piece?
Yeah, that was because it was really interesting. And it was, we were fortunate in that we just run a survey on how people, as I said, access spaces just the year prior to COVID starting. So we kind of had something to compare it back to, which was great to be able to do, because we're not often in that position. So we looked at how people use spaces prior to COVID, and then again, how they used it during COVID. And one thing that we definitely found, which I guess is very interesting, is yes, that people used blue and green spaces more. And again, that was kind of hardly surprising, but people used their local spaces more. A lot of people discovered, or often actually predominantly so rediscovered, those blue and green spaces in their local neighborhoods. So, I found it for myself. I went for walks within my 2-kilometer radius, and I found a park I'd never been to. It was gorgeous. I was so excited. And it was just kind of hidden, like it was a really narrow lane that led down to it. I'd never go and walked it down, because I was basically walking every single available road and lane during lockdown. And I think everybody else found the same. And you kind of going, oh, sure, look, I've never been down here. I'll go and pop down there and see what happens. And I think everybody or most people took that sort of approach to actually go out and rediscover their own neighborhoods and rediscover blue spaces. What was great to see in all of that is that there's actually very high levels of satisfaction with people in Ireland with their local neighborhoods. People felt quite safe in their own neighborhoods. People felt that, they were of high enough quality and standards to actually want to spend time in them. Although, again, not all of them. So there are definitely some spaces that do require work and kind of upkeep. But in general, people felt that spaces were available to them and they were using them more so. But again, as I said, not surprising, but it was good to see that people also felt that it was of benefit to them. So, which was really, really good, because all of a sudden people felt that just a number of barriers were removed. One of them obviously being time. We all found ourselves in a very unusual situation where we were figuring out how to work from home. It maybe not actually being able to do as much work as we normally would, or even finding that our days are allowed much more flexibility. So that to some extent that barrier of time was removed. Now, in fairness, we were also on occasion very lucky that we had very good weather. So that means that people are more inclined to actually spend time outdoors, because actually that's something I didn't mention earlier, that weather is definitely a deterrent in Ireland. Hardly surprising. Yeah. I mean, if we just think back over the last couple of days, they really weren't great. And most of us spent less time outdoors in those days than we do in times like when it's lovely and sunny. So COVID was interesting from that perspective, and that, yes, I said people really rediscovered spaces, but people obviously predominantly spent more time in their own gardens as well. That's again hardly surprising, because we didn't know whether we could go out, where we could go. So and it was predominant. It's interesting because it's often younger age groups that wouldn't have as much time, that they wouldn't have spent as much time outdoors as older age groups. So we did find that again in COVID, even more so, that different age groups spent different amounts of time outside. It slightly increased for all of them, but in particular in older age groups, it went up. So that's, I was going to say that there were some of the findings. But yeah, as I said, it was really interesting in terms of looking at people's increased time spent outside, more time spent in local spaces, because people rediscovered spaces even within their 2K radius, because we asked kind of what distance from the home the different spaces were. And it's good to see that people are actually spending more time in their local neighborhoods and now getting invested in them, because they're now being, used more, which means it's also beneficial to these spaces to actually have more demands on them, because then people are more likely to keep up the work that they have in them. But I think, I was going to say, I think there were some of the main findings that we have. We did see as well in general that people actually reported pretty good health themselves, which was great to see. Again, that even in times of COVID, people were quite aware of their own health and well-being, and reported good their own health as being quite good. So that we didn't actually see an awful lot of changes between that, but actually, as a matter of fact, in some cases people did report better health during COVID, because maybe they were even more aware of their own and health well-being than they were previously. So that was interesting to see.
Are you optimistic as to whether or not this is going to be sustainable or sustained? This increased use in green and blue spaces.
I hope so. I hope that people have, because they've had more time and maybe more opportunity to engage with blue and green spaces over repeated lockdowns, that they see that value that it brought for themselves, that they see that connection to these places, and that they therefore will kind of keep that up for themselves, for their own health and well-being. But maybe also that there are more requests being put forward to, let's say, for example, your local authorities to look after spaces more, to improve the facilities that are being provided. I see it for myself when I go for a walk. I see it for myself when I go for a swim outdoors. There are more people out and about, and it's still brilliant to see. And I hope that people do keep it up, because all the evidence has shown it's so good for us. And then from that purely sort of environmental science point of it, bringing it back to looking after these spaces, it's great to see people have an interest and be engaged with these spaces, because it has shown us that people are more willing to look after spaces if they see that what value they have. Which actually does remind me as well, we even have seen that things such as doing a litter pick or kind of clean coast activities is great for people from their physical and mental health perspective. So, again, even a pro kind of environmental activity or kind of like a cleanup is really, really useful for people's health and well-being, but obviously also brilliant for outdoor spaces. So I'm really hoping people keep it up, because it's good for all of us and for our environment.
I suppose that kind of answered another question that I wanted to ask you, is that like if more people are out using these spaces, is there an issue there from an environmental conservation perspective, but you kind of seems to
Well,
that.
yeah, to be honest, I mean, I gave you the positive of it, but obviously there is the negative side of it as well. There is the idea that some spaces have limited carrying capacity, that maybe some places are being overused. And I think we've seen it in some cases in some of the places that all of a sudden we had severe issues with trying to accommodate the huge influx of cars trying to go to places. People finding alternative locations to park a car or alternative access routes to sites, meaning that, we would have had increased footfall, increased damage to areas, because that's just unfortunately what happens the more people go outside. So it's again looking at the facilities that we have and maybe being able to say, well, look, some of these places are being increasingly used. So maybe we do need to look at how we provide access to these places. How do we make sure that we look after these places, protect them so they can provide all of those benefits that we're all coming out there to experience in a way that is suitable for different numbers of people. So it is kind of figuring that out as well. I mean, it's things such as access to coastal areas needs to, in some cases, be looked at, because we do see people driving across, let's say, for example, dunes, trying to park as close to a beach as possible, when that's not ideal behaviour. So part of that there is that we need to look at what's available, how can we make it accessible, and education for people, that we do remind people that the only way that these places can exist is if we do treat them with respect. Because if we don't look after our own behaviour in these places will not continue to exist for us and for us to use them. So it's kind of, it's about finding that balance. It's about finding that compromise between our use and enjoyment of them and looking after them to make sure that they persist into the future, because that's what's really, really important. Some of the work that we would have done would have linked in with the likes of Leave No Trace as well, because they do an awful lot of work in educating people about how to access outdoor spaces responsibly. And I think that's really where the problem is, that we need to make sure that that bit of education gets in there as well. It's not just about purely the provision of these spaces, it's also about the education for the users.
Yeah, I actually had someone on the podcast last week, Ellie Berry from Tough Souls, and she works with Leave No Trace, but we were kind of speaking about that, like, are people environmentally conscious when they are going out and using trails and using mountains and things like that? And you mentioned, we have to respect these places. Like, I'm not sure whether you know of any research out there, like, as to different population groups and how environmentally conscious they might be. Are children aware of different things that they're doing that might be damaging our natural spaces? Are older adults versus adults? I'm not sure.
No, it's a really good question. And I actually, just top of the head right now, I don't. There might possibly be something out there, but I can't think of anything right now. But I mean, we do know, for example, that there's an awful lot of education aimed at children, but I tend to think that that's not sufficient. It's not just making sure that we educate children. Yes, it's brilliant because they should grow up into responsible adults, but it is often also making sure that the adults who might be setting the example are equally as educated, so that we kind of have a broader approach to information and education on responsible behaviour. Look, and we do know it unfortunately happens even despite people's best intentions. I mean, I've done some work, for example, in coastal areas, and again, it's that idea of people kind of maybe driving across dunes or kind of saying, well, actually, I didn't drive onto the dunes. I drove over here, and you're kind of going, yeah. And unfortunately, where you've driven is actually protected habitat, but it's because there may not be information, there may not be signage to tell people about this. So then how can we expect them to do the right thing if we're not giving that information to them? So it is about making sure that information is being put out there and being made available. Because that's the thing. I don't at any point in time want to see people prevented from going outside, but we do need to find a compromise and a balance and making sure that we can all still use it. Because I mean, look, I'm the first person who's going to be distraught if I can't go to a place anymore because it's in some way, shape or form ruined. If there's a mountain that I love climbing and all of a sudden I find it's been trampled upon by loads and loads of people and the vegetation is gone and the species or the birds that used to come there are no longer going to it, then, it's it's really upsetting to see. And as well as that, others who come to it then will not find it as beautiful as it was before. So it's kind of about finding a solution and making sure that we don't ruin what is so good and beneficial for all of us and what we do love and enjoy so much.
I know I'm kind of jumping back again to what we were talking about before. We were talking about COVID and that publication that you were involved in. In the end of that publication, there was a sentence I've written down here, and it's talk about resetting the system and altering our behaviors and attitudes towards green spaces. I'd love if you could maybe expand a little bit on that. Like what does resetting the system look like?
I think resetting the system, ultimately, it's about looking at what these places do for us, that renewed appreciation of these places, and the recognition that they're incredibly valuable for us, but also how we maintain these places. Kind of, going back to I guess a lot of things that I've already said, it's about recognizing the value these spaces have for us. Even the smallest park can be incredibly valuable to those who live around it. And it is about recognizing the value that is there and maybe shifting our perspective to that value of how we use these spaces and that responsible use of them, but putting that incredible value for our own health and well-being first. Because I think it's the time now that we're incredibly aware of our own health, and that it is about focusing on that aspect of it, but it's about the recognition of the incredible job or the incredible connection that we have with nature. Without nature, we're quite lost. We need nature for our own survival. It goes beyond just providing spaces for us to where we get our food and water from. It is about spaces that keep us healthy. And that's really what it comes down to, that recognizing that we're part of nature and nature is what sustains us. It's what keeps this whole thing ticking and what keeps us healthy. And we really, really need to look after it, not just for its own sake. It has its own value, obviously, kind of that intrinsic value, but for the fact that it is incredibly valuable to us and our own health and well-being.
Yeah, and I suppose the importance of this research, like to kind of give to policymakers and things like that when these spaces are at risk of being taken away from us, is so important as well. Can I ask about your own use of these spaces during COVID? Did you find you were using spaces more, these green and blue spaces, more or less?
Oh, I use them so much more. I mean, I've always obviously used them quite a good bit, but I have turned into a 3 walks a day person. Basically, I'd get up and the first thing I did was go for a walk, just to, on the one hand, kind of get up, wake up, but also in a way, I guess, mimic that walk to work because all of a sudden I was working from home, and you live at home, you work at home, so kind of to have my breakfast, go for a walk in my neighborhood, go through the local park, and then come home and sit down at my desk and kind of go, now I'm at work, to kind of, I guess, in a way, give myself that distance between home life and work life. And I do the same again at lunchtime. And then at dinner, like before dinner, kind of after work, get up, go for a walk and sit down for my dinner. So it was kind of trying to give myself that disconnect from work, from this being in the same space the entire time, but also just, it's a space for kind of to find that solace, that moment of peace, that kind of decompression. So as I said, I found myself, I was walking an awful lot more. I found an awful lot more parks that I didn't know about before. And I'm really lucky I live close to the sea. So being able to walk to the sea was an incredible luxury. I've always been, I've been a sea swimmer for years. And it was kind of, again, it was this kind of bit that kept me sane as well, being able to go out for a swim. And even at a distance, you'd meet other people, you'd meet like-minded people who you could have a chat about, even just with the sea. And it was nice to have that social connection as well. We were limited into where we could go and, that interaction, but even to be able to call out to somebody across the beach to say, oh, it's a lovely day for it, isn't it? Kind of provided a really, really nice kind of moment of, oh yeah, okay, I'm not here on my own, so Oh no, I found myself absolutely craving kind of an outdoor hike. I live in Galway City, and we look across at the burn. So like going down to the beach, looking at the burn, I was like, look at it over there, looking fabulous. I cannot wait to go. So I find myself yearning for those spaces and having to make up for a walk in the burn by finding another way to walk. I was really lucky as well that I have, for example, a river walk up the River Corrib nearby. So again, within my 2 kilometers. So it was great to have these spaces, but I really valued them, incredibly so. And it's great to see that other people found these spaces as well, because it was, again, it gave you that kind of sense of connection as well, the kind of connection of like, yes, we're all in the same boat together. We're all kind of figuring out how to maneuver around it. And yeah, for myself, I definitely used spaces where I think most of us will have found that, if we're looking to go away from our own four walls, we were looking for spaces outdoors. And I mean, I found it, one of the things I really noticed is that where I live at the moment is I'm in an apartment, so I don't have a garden, So I think that was partially as well. I was like, oh no, I must get out. I have to get out somewhere. find that little bit of nature somewhere. Whether that's, again, sitting down by the sea or sitting down by the river or just going for a walk in the park or even just, sitting on a bench in a park. It was great to be able to have access to these spaces. So I fully understand. I found for myself that it used increased. So I totally understand that it increased for other people as well. And again, I saw firsthand that value that it had for me, because you do sometimes forget, especially when you carry out this kind of research, you're surrounded by it all the time. And sometimes you just want to get away from that. And the only way to get away from it is to go out into nature. And I'm like, oh, isn't this ironic? I'm doing exactly what I'm normally studying. This is just, so, but no, I definitely during COVID found it for myself. I had to get out.
I don't think you're, as you said, you're not alone. Like the Sport Ireland studies that were kind of being conducted over the course of COVID as well, like seeing that upwards of 85% of people were walking at least once a week. Like that's just unbelievable. Now I know there are some issues with that study and sample size and things like that, but it's an unreal indication as to where we are. And like it seems like I did a bit of work as part of my PhD looking at the use of trails over the course of COVID, and like we've surpassed our 2019 figures in terms of the use of some of the trails in Ireland, and it was actually sustained into the winter months, which is something that I didn't anticipate finding. But like I'm like you, I just really, really hope that we kind of keep walking as much as we're walking.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. As I said, I just, for myself, I find it great, but I also see for other people, it's been great. And I mean, just in terms of if we're looking at numbers, if we're looking at the surveys we carried out, most people went out at least twice a week for a walk, and, that's great to see. And it is also, I think, like the beauty of walking in particular, I think, is that it doesn't require any major expertise. It doesn't require specialist equipment. We can put on a pair of shoes and a raincoat because it's Ireland and go for a walk, and you don't have to go. A lot of the times you don't have to go far. It's about, finding a place that you enjoy walking to, and also maybe stopping to observe what you can find along the way and keeping an eye on it. Because I do think that people did that increasingly over COVID as well. They actually stopped to notice an awful lot more in their local neighborhoods. They notice nature an awful lot more, which is great. So again, you might people who actually, now found an awful lot more about flowers and observe the seasons much more actively, which is great to see as well, because it does bring us back. I guess we have become quite disconnected from nature, but by spending more time in it, we do reconnect it. And we kind of look for that natural processes. So we were looking for small changes. And I think, again, I found it for myself that I was kind of going, oh, look, there's a bud that's coming out on the trees and, the leaves are opening. So you kind of look out for all these events in nature an awful lot more, because it's the change that you crave, that you want to see, because so little else was changing, in particular over COVID, that we really paid much more attention to what was going on around us. But it is, as I said, it was great to see. And I hope that people do keep that connection up, that observation as well of what's going on around them, because there's so much to see. We're so lucky with what we have around us, which is as I said, something of quite a privilege in many cases. Now, I do actually have to say that we did find that there are some differences in terms of access between urban areas and rural areas. So that is always something to keep in mind, and something that hopefully will be addressed. I'd like to see that being addressed, that we make it all an awful lot more accessible for everybody, because that's the thing, we can't just focus on particular areas. It needs to be accessible for, as I said, across the board, be that across levels of ability, across life course, but also across the kind of whole geographical area.
And what were the differences between urban and rural in terms of access? Was there more?
Interestingly enough, people found access more difficult in rural areas.
Wow.
Because I know it's interesting, isn't it? Because we often think, if we think about rural areas, I guess we think about green fields and we think about woodlands and we think about places to go out to, but a lot of these places they're private lands. They're agricultural fields. So these are not spaces that you can necessarily go for walking, because there might be crops growing, there might be animals in the field, but also it's that access to private land issue that we still have in a lot of cases, that private land isn't accessible to most of us to go for walks. So people in rural areas, found themselves limited to having to walk on the road, which is often maybe something that's scary, not safe, not somewhere you might want to take your children along to. So it was sometimes more difficult for people in rural areas to access blue or green spaces. They might be limited to the local GIA fields in let's say a village, for example. Now, in fairness, it is getting better. We're getting, we're seeing an awful lot more of development of walking routes and that sort of thing. But at this moment in time, we do still see, at least from our surveys, that people in a number of rural areas find it more difficult to access blue and green spaces. So that is something that we definitely need to look at. And of course, as well, in urban areas, we do see that there are differences between different parts of urban areas, depending on kind of the socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's something that does need to be addressed. So I
suppose that's that idea that you mentioned earlier, like nature being something that's far away, which is like, as you said, rural areas, you would think that they are in it, and there's this idea of being far away.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's that, as I said, for some people, it's that nature is far away. For some people, it's that, it's right outside the door, but they can't access it because it's actually not part of their own property, or so they might have a view of it, and we do know that having a view of a blue or green space is already good for you, but you might have a view of it, we might not be able to actually go there. So that's something that we do need to look at in terms of how accessible areas actually are. So kind of looking at that side of things, because it is, while a lot of things are great, there's still some more work to be done. So there's still work to be done in terms of what is or isn't accessible to people, and to which groups of people. But it is also, maybe to some extent, shifting that perspective. So if somebody only thinks of nature as something that's really far away and very exposed and kind of very, very, kind of remote, to kind of shift that gaze a little bit more closer to home and look at areas that are accessible to you much more nearby. So as I said, even if it's a small park nearby, if it's a river that runs through, or a stream that runs through an area, if it's even just nice grassy verges that you could look after and see what's going on in them, so there are opportunities, but we do need to kind of maybe shift what our perception of nature is, where we can find it and how we can engage with it.
That's something that you plan on researching in the future. Do you know kind of what's next for your research group?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good question. No, we're obviously keen to look into an awful lot more of this, because again, I do think there's still more to be done. And to be honest, we still have loads of data that we haven't had 2 seconds to look at yet to kind of investigate this a little bit more. We want to delve further actually into different groups and kind of where the difference are between different population groups in Ireland, and looking at how we can again promote that access and that engagement with blue and green spaces for people. And as I said, it should be for everybody. So I guess what it comes back to is looking more at how can nature be accessible for everybody, because we do know it's not just yet. At the same time, it's not about forcing people outside, but it's at least giving them the option to do so, maybe encouraging them to do so. But no, there's still more to be done yet. As I said, I still think that we're by no means done in terms of the research that we have, be it looking further at all of our survey data that we still have. I'm slightly daunted by the amount of that's there, but that's that's a different story. It's like, oh god, there's still an awful lot there that we need to look at. But no, then taking it to the next step and kind of looking at where we can look at that promotion of the outdoor engagement, the kind of nature-based activities that we can look at, how we can get more people out there.
A lot of interesting work to be done, definitely. It's just whether or not you have the time to start going through the survey data, but sure.
Oh, look, I mean, I think everybody who's done kind of research into these kind of areas, you just end up with a lot of data. It's like, right, what do I do now? It's just trying to find, it's always about trying to find a balance, whether that's, in terms of how we use outdoor spaces or how we manage our time. Eventually we'll get there. Figure it out.
At least you have it. At least you have it sitting there. Gesche, it's something that I ask everybody towards the end of the podcast. Do you have a favorite place to go for a walk yourself?
I love the Burren. I absolutely love the Burren. I think this year more than ever, it's looking spectacular. I've never seen it look so beautiful and full of orchids, and it's absolutely stunning. I'm not sure that I have a particular walk in the Burren that I would go with, but I just, as I said, overall, I love the Burren. I love it for its kind of unique character, the kind of, that kind of predominantly rocky exterior. When you look at it, it just looks like this alien landscape. And when you come close, it has so much detail and so much to see and so many beautiful, beautiful plants growing in it. I love the way it's being looked after in terms of farming for conservation. And I just think it's absolutely stunning place to go and visit. It has loads of archaeology in it as well, which kind of shows its land use over time. To me, it's a standout beauty spot that is very close by. At the same time, you cannot knock a place like, a hike in the mountains in Kerry. It's difficult. But as I said, the first thing that springs to mind when you asked me that question was the Burren. So it's, as I said, I love it.
If that isn't an advertisement for the Burren, I don't know what is. But look, I've never been walking up in the Burren.
Oh yeah, no, go. Yeah, loads of gorgeous places. I'm, can't believe you haven't been. Go quickly,
yeah,
go soon.
We had Joanne and Tony from Nordic Fitness Ireland on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and they have a Nordic Fitness group that are based in the Burren, and they do lots of walks there. So I'll definitely try and get up there at some point.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm terrible for basically dragging everybody out for a walk there, because it's, if you come to visit me in Galway, it's like, oh, we'll go for a walk. Yeah. And we'll definitely head out. We'll definitely head out to the Burren at some point or other. That's why I found lockdown so hard. So I was looking at it across the bay going, it's over there and I cannot go. So
brilliant. Gesche, can I just say thanks very much for your time? I really appreciate it. And it was such an interesting conversation.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I haven't, thrown too many things at people there, but I do think it's such a fascinating topic. I think there's still so much more to learn. And I just love the fact that a lot of our research shows that people already value nature so highly. And I just want to kind of get everybody to think about nature that way. It's something so important to us. So it's, as I said, it's exciting, and hopefully we'll find out more and have more good messages coming out in the future about how we can all look after ourselves and our blue and green spaces.
Super. Thanks
a million for having me.
Thank you. If you want more information about Get Ireland Walking, please visit our website at www.getirelandwalking.ie or visit our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram pages.